Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're in the US. We'll get started now. Thanks for joining. Today, we're talking about proposals, quotes, legal agreements, and contracts, and why all this matters. As an MSP, you're in a world filled with complexity, challenge, and change, and risk. And by getting on top of that risk and managing it well, an MSP can support the growth, the success, and the value of their MSP. So we're talking about proposals and contracts. We'll talk about how you're using proposals. We'll talk about quoting tools and why all this matters, the impact on your business, and a simple but effective approach that you can take home and use in your MSP. Let's look at this slide here. Proposals help to win new business. If you think of proposals like that, you can contrast with what a contract does. And a contract seals the deal and it protects your business. You may see, therefore, that proposals can be the thing that's used to seal the deal. So we'll be exploring this a little more, the difference between proposals and contracts and how you're using them. If you think you don't use contracts, as lots of MSPs would probably believe, think again, because you probably do. And your accepted proposal, in fact, can be the thing, of course, that seals the deal. In that case, this might be your contract. That might be a little bit of a new perspective for some of you, because you think you're sending out proposals, you think you don't have contracts, but in fact, your accepted proposal can be that contract. The trouble with this, it's not usually suitable for that purpose. And we'll have a look at this as we go through. Although we're talking about proposals and potentially that the way you're using proposals can be forming a contract, your contract can include a whole bunch of other things which might be news to you. So, for example, email communications. When you're sending out a description of services or description of new products, laptops, licenses, and you're giving pricing and your customer confirms, that might well be your contract. Likewise, things like an ad hoc support request. A customer not on a managed service plan calls in and requests you to help with something. You take action, you're affirming that request. That can be your contract. Now, that can be quite alarming because you're touching their environment, you're heading into areas of risk by taking that action, and potentially, yes, of course, you'll be responding to the particular support request, but the customer might have a view that that's going a little beyond what you actually do. A signed statement of work for a project. Now, I believe that a lot of projects are not covered by any contract at all. As we discuss with MSPs day in and day out, they might have a managed services agreement in place, but nothing for projects or out of scope work. So in fact, your proposal or your statement of work for that project, however it's described, and once accepted by the customer, can be a contract. So just pause and have a look at this list, because a lot of these things probably are not typically what you think of as a contract, but in fact, they are forming contracts. Of course, we've got on there the accepted proposal or quote, which can in itself be a contract, and likewise your signed formal legal agreement, which is probably the one thing on the list that you might recognise as, yes, that's probably a contract. But your contract also, aside from each or any of these, could be a combination. So this is where, you need to be very careful about what's in these sort of communications. And there's no problem with the way that you're probably going about these things, apart from introducing some greater protection, greater legal content, and you can do that in some cases, for example, with email communications, simply by referencing terms and conditions, and likewise with proposals and quotes. But we're going to go through and see what might be wrong with those sorts of accepted proposals as contracts as well. So we are focusing on proposals in this session. How is the proposal sent and on what basis? A lot of you are probably sending proposals on their own. And so in this situation, probably don't recognise that when that proposal is accepted, it's forming a contract. Others might be sending the proposal with a legal agreement, or sending the legal agreement later. And we'll talk about both of those situations. If you're only sending a proposal, please recognise that that proposal, once accepted, is your contract. So the person on the left there that says we don't use contracts needs to think again. And in fact, perhaps that will cause a little bit of alarm, because what's in their proposal is probably not sufficient. Likewise with the person on the right, we don't want to lock customers in. And this is a common one where people believe they're not using contracts, or they don't want contracts because their managed service is on a month-to-month basis and they don't want to lock customers in. However, that's still a contract. There's still risk, you're still providing services, and it still needs probably a lot more detail than what is currently being thought of for those month-to-month arrangements. Indeed, without the right content, you're exposing your business entirely, because there wouldn't be any limitation of liability if you don't put those sorts of legal provisions into your proposals. So what's wrong with all of this? If you've been in business for a long time, as many of you have, and you're using an accepted proposal as a contract, what's wrong with that? Well, here are some things in terms of contract content. It's not made for that purpose. You haven't, most likely, have not written it to be a contract. You might fill it with all sorts of details about the managed service that you provide, pricing, and so on, but still, it's highly likely that important terms are left out and that it lacks legal protection. Proposals often also include what I would call brochure style content. So these are descriptions about the way that you go about providing service. It might be that, you know, you keep your customers safe and secure, you back up all data, those sorts of that sort of content that might belong on your website, even there, with some cautions on it. But if you're including that sort of content into your proposal, it's really not suitable for that purpose. General statements is another thing, backing up data. And, you know, backing up data will mean one thing to the customer and another thing to you. You know what you're backing up. The customer will believe that all data is backed up and that it's all 100% secure and recoverable in the event of an outage. Grey areas forms a big problem area with most proposals, simply because of the lack of content and the way that various items are described. You might think you're making it easy for the customer, easy to get that proposal accepted, but it does expose a lot of grey areas, things that are not articulated, and therefore a lot of risk and potential revenue leakage. So we can look at the content of these proposals and pull apart and say what's wrong with it. But what's really wrong is that it exposes your MSP to risk. It exposes your MSP to revenue leakage. And that's really the problem. You know, if your business was operating optimally and you had zero revenue leakage, then perhaps it's not a big problem. But nevertheless, even in that case, and I have never seen an MSP in that situation, even in that case, there is still the exposure to risk in the event of litigation. So we've talked about proposals and quotes being sent on their own without legal content, shall we say. That legal agreement, it can be what looks like a legal agreement. It can be terms and conditions. If you are in fact sending proposals with legal agreements, this is another category altogether. And in fact, you might think you're doing the right thing, but it depends very much on what's in that proposal and what's in that legal agreement. If you're sending out legal agreements for all your managed service customers, congratulations, that's great. But again, it depends what's in that managed service agreement. So if you are using proposals and your proposal is what is carrying all the weight and description of the managed service, again, think back to the issues with that I've just been through. And in those sorts of cases, often the legal agreement is very generic and does not really suit the purpose of being used for managed services. If you're using legal agreements for all customers, again, congratulations, that's great. But what is in that legal agreement? If it's one agreement that you're trying to use to cover all types of services, that's going to be problematic. Again, if your proposal is what's carrying the weight of description of all of the products and services you're providing, again, likely to be somewhat problematic. So we see things like, for example, with backup services, people putting content in such as, a secure, reliable backup of all your critical data. Now, that's the sort of line that could easily get you into trouble because backups are not necessarily secure, not necessarily reliable, and who's determining whether data is critical or not. So this is certainly a good way to go, using proposals and quotes with legal agreements, but it really comes down to what's in the proposals and what's in the legal agreements. The other aspect, of course, is how they fit together and what is actually forming the contract. So using proposals, you'd want to be referencing the legal agreement and making that proposal subject to the legal agreement so that the proposal is not actually forming part of the contract. And let's be really clear about that because, as you've heard, the types of issues that arise with proposals, you want to move on from that proposal and have your legal agreement, which has got all of the content and description of the products and services and managed services and so on in it, so that the legal agreement is carrying the totality of what you're actually agreeing. And then that legal agreement is your contract. That said, if it's a quote, for example, for Microsoft 365, 10 new licenses of premium, that quote together with the relevant agreement, so then you're not having to sign a new agreement every time your customer orders 365 licenses, can work together. So it's important that you're very clear on what's forming your contract and indeed how they fit together. If you've got more than one document that forms your contract, that certainly can be the case, we need to look at how they fit together. What is the priority if they're inconsistent, and what is the impact of one on the other? You'll see this guy on the left. I've signed up a new customer. Now I need a contract. So the question there is, what has he actually signed with that customer? Because as you probably have realized by now, what's been signed could well already be the contract. So then he's trying to impose effectively another contract on top of that existing contract, which can certainly cause issues. So be clear about, think about seal the deal. When is the deal being sealed? When do you and the customer believe that you have sealed the deal? Because that is probably, whatever's forming that deal is probably your contract. And if that is the accepted proposal, then you need to start thinking about that as a contract. Again, not suitable as a contract, so that kind of process needs to be altered. I've just got one slide on quoting tools, although we could probably have a whole session on quoting tools. We see a lot of issues with the way that MSPs are using quoting tools, and in fact, a lot of issues with the way that the quoting tools allow MSPs to use them. So one of the things is that the quoting tool often has default agreements in it. And these, are put in by the quoting tool provider to be helpful, of course, and they serve as a starting point. However, they're often not a very suitable starting point, and particularly where you have purpose-built agreements for the services that you're providing, it's highly likely that you need to remove that default agreement from what's going out to your customers and insert or have that service specific agreement apply instead, whether that's being sent with the proposal or afterwards. Likewise with default terms and conditions. Now, some of that might be needed. It's a matter of what it actually says and how it fits with the other legal documents that you are using with that quoting tool. We have seen issues with MSPs using quoting tools, getting acceptance of attachments by signature on a quote that's sent out. And that certainly can be problematic, especially if their attention to those attachments is not sufficient. What I mean by that is they can easily sign the quote without really seeing or acknowledging the attachment. Even then, what they're signing is important and where that signature is going. We've seen situations where the signature that a customer puts on a quote is then being applied by the quoting tool into the agreements that are attached. So the customer's not actually signing the attachments, but the quoting tool is applying their signature into them. Now, this is, as I hope you appreciate, highly problematic. Not only the customer can deny signing the attachment, but you've got no evidence often of what the contract is actually comprises. Likewise, what is sent to the customer after signing. Now, please be careful with this because some of the tools are sending out the document that is actually signed by the customer without sending the attachments. So if there was any subsequent dispute or issue around what forms the contract, you've probably got no evidence that that attachment was actually sent, and certainly that the customer has actually accepted it. So a word of warning about quoting tools. Obviously, they're very, very helpful, and I don't mean stop using them by any means, but be careful around how you're using them in terms of those sorts of elements. So that may have sounded quite kind of legal content, and I don't mean to overwhelm you with that, but the important thing is, why does it all matter? Now, why it matters is because what you're agreeing with your customers has a direct impact on the success of your MSP. If you look at the global industry average, MSPs are generally at 6% EBITDA to gross revenue, so not very high. Of course, a lot of you might be higher than that, and higher performing MSPs will be up around the 18, potentially in the 20s EBITDA to gross revenue, which is great. But a lot of MSPs are not performing all that well, and in fact 46% are not even profitable. So there is plenty of room for improvement there. And the way we look at it is that while you're working really, really hard and MSPs are, totally passionate about providing great service, we'd love to see you more successful. Even if you're in that 18 to 22 range of EBITDA to gross revenue, there's still areas of revenue leakage, and often that can be at least 5% of revenue. So how does this correlate to your contract? Well, if you think about your contract, it's really what you're agreeing with your customer, except for that agreement is legally enforceable. Now, often, of course, we have that agreement in writing, and that is really necessary in the MSP world because the services that you're providing are so complex. You couldn't hope to have people remembering what your agreement is, or certainly acknowledging that that's what's being agreed. So definitely we need the contract in writing, and then the contract is really a written record of what you're agreeing. Now, think of it in terms of not only providing protection in the event of being sued. Certainly that's a good reason to have a written contract with all the appropriate protection, but fortunately, that's not often what happens with MSPs, not often sued. Of course, we do need to take care of that, but the much more common area of risk and where the revenue leakage occurs is the performance elements of the contract. And that is what you're agreeing to do, your service commitment, and in return, what the customer's obligations are. When customers come to you, it's because they can easily see that you and your team have loads of experience, expertise, and skills. They trust you. Now, that trust alone is great. In fact, it's essential, but trust alone causes problems. And so what we want to move to understand is, there is a barrier of expertise, as we've labeled it there, a barrier meaning you and your team are up here in terms of your skills, expertise, and experience, and your customers are typically way down here, not really having a strong understanding of what you're doing for them. Now, they're never going to understand it to your level, but the way that you communicate with your customers is extremely important so that you're speaking in language that they understand. Likewise, that the contracts that you send out are in a language that they understand. They're not something that's totally separate from what's going on. They're actually a record, as I've said, of what you're agreeing. So in that sense, you as the MSP owner or the contract manager within the MSP should totally understand what's in that contract. It needs to make sense to you. It also needs to make sense to your customers when they receive it. Now, of course, they may not and most likely will not read all of the contract, but you do want to present contracts that have the key elements, the service commitment elements and their obligations, the pricing, the term, and all of those sorts of things presented in such a way that they can easily understand what's going on, the what's in scope, the what's out of scope, those sorts of elements. If they don't want to read the confidentiality and the dispute resolution procedures and personal data protection provisions, that is not going to cause a problem. That's on them. But you do want them to fundamentally understand your service commitment and their obligations, and that is as recorded in the contract. So these revenue leakage areas, what am I talking about here? We've had one MSP in particular, I recall, coming to us, and the CEO said, we just don't have any problems with contracts. Our customers just sign the contract and we get on with providing the service. The trouble is, they said, that after that contract is signed, the same types of problems start to reappear. Our engineers handling out of scope tickets at no additional charge, little projects creeping in and being done as part of the managed service, engineers that are on site doing a little bit extra while they're there without recording that and without that being captured and charged to the customer. And so the important factor here, and what you can see from that scenario, is the MSP owner, the CEO there, did not recognize that all of those areas of revenue leakage where their monthly recurring revenue was being chipped away at all of the time could be turned around if only they had better agreement with their customer about what's in scope and what's out of scope. So this is a really key area. It often can seem daunting or difficult to articulate into a contract, but it certainly will pay you dividends in terms of you and your team members knowing what's in scope, what's out of scope, and being able to capture that out of scope work. Second issue here is MSPs and customers thinking the MSP is responsible for keeping them 100% secure. Now, of course, no one can guarantee security, and even more so because the security services that you're providing are so dependent on vendor products. And indeed, the vendors do not take full responsibility for the products. So then why would the MSP? And this needs to be reflected through into your contracts. Likewise, with all of the other types of products that you are reselling um, and the basis on which you're providing services with that underpinning of vendors' products, recognizing in your contracts, recognizing to your customers that you're not responsible for the performance, the availability, the functionality of those products. And the third element I've listed here, and there are quite a number more, I've just identified 3 of the most common areas, is customers not taking up MSP's recommendations. So you've probably all seen and experienced situations of the customer delaying a project that really needs to be carried out, choosing a lower priced option, all of which is going against your recommendation and adding risk to you and your business. So we need also an effective way of dealing with those sorts of scenarios. So think about what I said in terms of contracts, that there is the part that helps if you ever were to face litigation or legal proceedings. And, we hope that never happens, of course. But the sorts of things that happen day in and day out, this is where your contract can and should provide you a lot of protection and really work to help you reduce those areas of revenue leakage. I said I'd talk about the contract mistake that everyone's making. I should say that most MSPs are making, and that is going ahead and providing products and services without first having a service-specific contract in place. And that can be, of course, for your large services, your managed security services, and all the services that really support the bulk of your revenue. It's can be much easier. What about all of the other areas? And let's look at some of those. It's super important that there's contractual protection in place for those as well. So if you look at some of these areas on the right, projects, you might think, yes, you've got a statement of work for larger projects, but a lot of the projects are very short. How do you protect that? And there are some simple mechanisms that you can put in place to protect and capture that revenue that's on the right. I put the virtual CIO and virtual CISO there because they don't tend to be the thing that really drives most of your revenue, but certainly you want very service-specific contracts in place for that. On the left, all of the elements, especially the managed services that drive the bulk of your revenue, and in both categories, we see MSPs experiencing revenue leakage. So those areas are what really needs to be firmed up to support a greater level of revenue, greater level of profitability. And the other element that is a nice positive out of all of this is the creation of further upsell opportunities. So if you look at all these service-specific contracts, we're really putting a boundary around each service, and that in itself creates the upsell opportunity. It's much harder for the customer then to believe that you are responsible for everything. The process that I would advocate that you put in place, it's really about using service-specific contracts, not supplying any products or services without contracts in place. And that doesn't mean for a 2-hour project you have to get the customer to sign a contract, but to have a process in place that covers that. So yes, for your big services, the services that make up most of your revenue, but think about all of these other elements, the site assessments, small projects, and so on. Now, I've jumped to the middle and end of that process, At the beginning, your proposals should be made subject to your standard contracts. And that's a simple line that can be added into your proposals. Same for quotes, the basis on which all of this is happening, so that the proposal is not the thing that's being used as your contract. And finally, on that slide, the team members need to be on board. So it's not a matter of, having these great contracts and no one in your team really knows what's in them. It doesn't mean to say that your team members need to study the contract, but they need to be on board and they need to know what's in scope, what's out of scope, and how things work. Your operations, your agreements need to be in sync. So, in summary, when you use the right sorts of contracts and use them effectively, you will find that those everyday risks go down, that your revenue and profitability goes up, and also the very positive benefit of your MSP business value going up. So I'm happy to take any questions. You can see here the QR codes for those that have not attended for the live session but are watching the recording. Please feel free to book a demo if you want to discuss any of these points, and we'll go through that with you. It's been great having you with us, and thanks for watching this webinar.